This week we read in the portion of Hamishpatim, and this is post-Sinai. Last week we had read about the Aseret Adibros, the 10 Commandments. The portion concludes with the building of the Mizbeach and how it has to be, the stone has to be cut, and how you ascend the altar on a ramp. One does not ascend it on with steps. And then the Torah begins, and these are the laws. Ela mishpatim shatosim lifneim. These are the laws that you present before them. And what's the first of the laws? Kisigna Eved Ivri. If you purchase a Jewish slave. Now, why was this man sold into slavery? Because he had stolen, and he was not able to repay the person he victimized. And the only way we're able to come up with that amount of money, because nobody else wants to provide him with that means to repay the victim. His value is the equivalent of the theft. He's sold into slavery. He has a master, and the extent of the slavery is 6 years. You cannot sell the Jewish slave more than 6 years. In the 7th year, he goes out free. What happens after 6 years? And during the 6-year period, the master has a right to provide a woman to him who's not even fully Jewish. It's a woman who's normally not permitted to him. She's a Canaanite slave woman, which as a free man, if he engages with this woman, he's subject to malchus, to corporal punishment. But in the state of being a slave, the master could impose this on the slave. And he becomes a breeder. He breeds, he has children from this woman during this period of time. Because she's not a Jewish woman, these children halachically are not his children. After 6 years, he's freed to return to his family. She remains with her master because she's considered his chattel. And the children, being her children, they're also considered slaves. They're also the master's chattel. What happens after 6 years? He says to the master, he goes to the court who sold him to slavery. He says, I love my master. You understand? The man's a slave, 6 years. I love my master. I love my wife. She's not really his wife. She's not a married woman. But because of his level of relation with her, he considers her his wife. As they say in Yiddish, ochedvei. Woe to us. A Jew could fall to a level because of his level of attachment. This Canaanite woman, he says to Bezdin, to the rabbinical court, I love my wife. I love my children. But they're not your children. They may be a biological issue, but halachically, they're not your children. But nevertheless, emotionally, mentally, he values them as his children, as he values her as his wife. So what did they do? The court goes, and they put an awl through the cartilage of his right ear, and he continues his period of slavery until the Jubilee year. The Jubilee year could be the next year. It could be 6 years. It could be in 43 years. That's how far off it could be. And he's considered a slave forever, meaning until the Jubilee year. Normally, after Sinai, we're referred to as Yisrael. That's the appellation given to the Jewish people. Ivri, Hebrew, is a pre-Sinai label. It's a pre-Sinai appellation. The Torah refers to this man as Eved Ivri. He's a Hebrew slave, not Eved Yisraeli. He's not what we call Israeli. I'm not even going to use the word Israeli, because a lot of people call themselves Israelis. It has nothing to do with the state of Israel. It should be Eved Yisraeli. Why is he referred to Eved Ivri? Now, why do you put the all through his ear? So the Talmud says, and Rashi cites this in his commentary, because evidently this man has some kind of defect in his processing and his attention focus and understanding things, and that's why this is his predicament in life. Why? Ozen zu sheshama b'Sinai, the ear that heard at Sinai, thou shalt not steal. And he stole. And because he stole and he wasn't able to make good, to reimburse the victim, as they used to say, the way you make your bed, that's the way you sleep. He complicated his own life, this man. So why did he complicate? If he would have been fully attentive at Sinai and been impacted by the words of God about not stealing, he wouldn't have stolen. If he would have stolen, this whole situation would have never come to this conclusion or to this disaster. So he has some kind of defect in his hearing. Therefore, the all is put through his ear to indicate he has faulty hearing, that he didn't fully comprehend and grasp this. He behaves like a pre-Sinai Jew, although era-wise, he's post-Sinai. Therefore, he's referred to as Eved Ivri. He's a Hebrew slave. He behaves like a Hebrew. That's one opinion. The other opinion is, and this is very, very interesting, and I picked it up for the first time, it touched me. The first of the 10 commandments, when God says, Anochi Hashem Elokecho, Asher Tzisicho Mi'eretz Mitzrayim, I am your God, took you out of Egypt, Mi Beis Avodim, from the house of bondage. Now, whose slaves were we? We weren't the slaves of the populace. We were the slaves of Paro. We were the slaves of royalty. So even in the state of slavery, we had a certain status. We were Pharaoh slaves. The base of Avodah was Pharaoh's. So meaning, as much as we endured slavery, but it was slavery that we were identified not as these lowly beings, but rather we're the slaves of the king. As the Talmud tells us, what happened at redemption? Before we were Avdei Paro, before we were Pharaoh's slaves, now we became Avdei Hashem. We are God's subjects. We are God's servants. That was the transition. From mortal royalty, lahavdil, to divine royalty. That was the transition. So I asked the question. So when we became God's subjects, servants, Hashem says, Avodayhem, you are my subjects. What is the inference of my subjects? You are not to be a subject of a subject. Once you're God's subjects, being a subject as a chattel of a human being, it's a disgrace. It's disgraceful. Could you imagine a Jew? He has a son, and the Jew is considered a person of pedigree because of we are the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. We are considered, as a result of Sinai, Goy Kadosh. We're a holy people. Mamleches Kohanim. You are a kingly priestly nation. And your son becomes a person oversees a gambling table in a casino. It's a disgrace. Could you imagine Prince Edward or Prince Charles working in Atlantic City in a casino? Could you imagine what it would do to Queen Elizabeth? She probably have a stroke when she's 98 years old. That's what would happen to her. Totally inappropriate. A Jew should allow himself to be sold as a slave. A person makes a mistake, but after 6 years, I love my master, I love my wife, I love my children. It's not your master, it's not your wife, it's not your children. A Jew only has one master. Only God's our master. So what do you mean you love? The answer is, you're in violation of what? You don't recall what happened at Sinai. We became God's subjects. Understanding and internalize that reality. How could you say that you want to be the subject of a mortal? It's the ultimate disgrace to yourself and to God. Therefore, you put the all through his ear. It never resonated with him. This man is a pre-Sinai Jew. He's not a post-Sinai Jew. He behaves like a pre, not a post. Therefore, the symbolic act of putting the all through his ear is to indicate that he has this deficiency. These are the two opinions. If it's for stealing, as they said, he didn't get it. It never resonated. The seriousness of stealing. Because if he would have heard it well, he would have never attempted to steal. And if he would have understood what it means to be God's subject, he would never considered selling himself as an indentured servant for financial reasons. Because it's the ultimate disgrace. We're coming off Sinai. We're coming off the heights of heights. God just spoke to us face to face, building an altar, bringing sacrifices. And the first thing we talk about is, if you're a thief and you should not be able to reimburse the victim who you victimized, you sold as a slave. It's insulting. You know who you were talking to? We're talking to a person who literally experienced God face to face, and you're telling him, you realize what you're going to be? You're going to be as if he's a sewer dredger. He's dredging sewers. It's insulting. But the Torah says no. Post-Sinai, the first thing we talk about is stealing and not being able to reimburse the victim. And having a non-Jewish woman being given to you, consider your wife, consider your master, and the children, not your children, if your children. It's mind-boggling. It's not to be believed. You know what the answer is? You could be at Sinai, but as they say in the vernacular, it's a slippery slope. The moment you make one mistake because you rest on certain laurels, or you believe that you're secure and you don't realize how vulnerable you are, you could be pushed off the cliff. When a person's pushed off the cliff and you have nothing to hold on to, it's free fall. And when you stop? When you hit the bottom. And usually when you hit the bottom, you splatter. And it's a mess and it's a disaster. And that's exactly what happens when you feel that you're secure and you have no concerns and you're not vulnerable. That's exactly when you're attacked. Excuse me, I just have to take 2 seconds. Yes.
Yeah, go back.
Okay, you going upstairs?
Yes, sir.
Okay, because could you close the door, sir? Because I know I'm recording
Yes, not
this.
a problem.
Thank you. Okay. So even after Sinai, what the Torah is telling us, through juxtaposing the laws of the Jewish slave, the Hebrew slave, and to the way he could speak, it's not to be believed. But as much as it's not to be believed, it's the reality of life. Sometimes a person has to make one mistake, and that one mistake could take him down, regardless of who he was. You have cases, people who are magnates in their area of industry, real estate, moguls, and they make one mistake due to their arrogance. That one mistake undermines their whole empire, and they're gone. The history. Because they acted arrogantly, taking certain risks, and that risk destroyed him totally. People have a certain sense of security and confidence, and they allow themselves certain liberties. That liberty takes you down, and it's over. Therefore, what the Torah is teaching us, through this juxtaposition, you never could feel secure. Though there's a question which is asked by the Midrash asked the question, and the early commentators asked this question, and they ask a question: what was the differentiator between the Jewish people and the nations of the world when the Torah was offered to them? The nations of the world, the question they were asked when it was offered to them, what is it all about? And when God told what it was all about, they said, it's not our cup of tea. It's not for us. When the Jews were offered the Torah, we never asked the question. We said, Nasa v'nishma. We accepted it unequivocally. We embraced it without a question. And then the Torah tells us, after we embraced it, accepting unequivocally, also on Torah alludes, God puts a mountain over our heads. And God gives us an ultimatum. Either you accept the Torah, or you're going to be buried under the mountain. It doesn't make any sense. Here we accept unequivocally, where God is astounded, as the Talmud tells us, Mi gila razel bonai, who revealed the secret to my children? They speak like angels. Next moment, he puts a gun to our temple and says, you better accept or else. We just said we accept unequivocally. What's God pushing it on us for? We accept it. So the Midrash answers that we only said Nasa v'nishma on the written law. On the oral law, where you have to dedicate your life to come upon its truth, that we weren't willing to. Observance of the mitzvah, studying the mitzvah superficially, that we agree to. But all the nuances and living it and studying it and meditating in it, dedicating our lives to it, and only through denying ourselves certain material amenities, that we weren't willing. God says, no, you have to. That's the mountain. Others, the early commentators answer that when they saw the fires at Sinai, this inferno, which represented the liability if you should fail, they said, maybe we were a little too hasty. Understanding the consequences, the liability of transgression, maybe we should pull out. God says, you're in forever. You're not pulling out. That's the mountain over our heads. However, the Orach Chaim HaKadosh, he introduces a whole new concept. We read in Pirkei Avos, Shimon HaTzadik B'Shiori Knesset Gdol Omer. Shimon HaTzadik, who's the remnant of the men of the High Assembly, says, one of the things he says is, Asu Siyog LeTorah. You should make a fence for the Torah. Meaning the rabbis are empowered to legislate fences wherever they feel fit, because there's a certain degree of vulnerability, they create rabbinic fences. Shimon HaTzadik says, is advising us, in addition to that, each of us know our personal weaknesses. We have to have self-imposed fences, knowing what our weaknesses are. But Sinai, God empowered the rabbis, the chachamim, that they could legislate fences, which we must abide by. And they have a right even to impose capital punishment if you should violate those fences, because that's considered a breach. It's a breach of the fence, and you could actually topple the Jewish people if you violate those fences. They said, something, but if the rabbis can make fences, and they're empowered to make fences, there's no end to it. The Torah we know, 613 dictates 248 positive, 365 negative, okay. It's self-contained. It's tenable. But beyond that, it's unlimited. The rabbis won't let me make a move. Every step, another fence. Lahavdil elf of those you ever see today, when they want to confine crowds, they have these metal barriers, and every 20 people, they put these metal railings, fences around them, and they're fenced in. They can't move. Every 20 feet, you're locked in. You can't move. The rabbis, every nuance of movement we make, they put a boot on us. You know, the way they put a boot on a car, you know, they lock down the car, you can't move it. You know what we said? We're not interested. God says, you will accept it. And they put a mountain over our heads. Why? Because understanding the vulnerability of a human being, without defense, the Torah will not survive. That's fact. We don't realize to what degree we're impressionable, we're vulnerable, and how we could be drawn in, and in a moment, our lives could be destroyed. The Chazal, because of their dimension of understanding and clarity, they understand things we don't understand. You know, a person just has a heart attack because he smoked 3 packs of cigarettes. So the cardiologist says to him, you know, Mr. Johnson, if you don't stop smoking, you realize it happens again, you may not survive it. Besides, you have to take off about 120 pounds of weight. Got to change your lifestyle. You have to change your diet. So he says, Doc, you don't want me to live? Doctor says, that's exactly what I tell you to follow my instructions, because I want you to live. Because if you allow yourself to continue in this way and even bring those foods in the house and allow whatever it may be, you know, some people at one time, they had to have their jaws locked. They had to have their jaws wired. They can't open their mouth. They can only drink through a straw. That's how out of control they were. A human being naturally is out of control. And you have to be, like years ago, they had what they call a horse, it was called the Bronco. The only way you could ride this horse that's wild, it had to be broken. Breaking that horse is part of the conditioning process. Fences are part of that conditioning process. As much as we want to break out, you can't go beyond that fence. It girds us, it holds us. You know, in Hebrew, most people don't know, unless you know, the word asur or isur means prohibition. Something's forbidden. But in Aramaic, asur means, or even in Hebrew, it means you're bound, you're shackled. Mutar means it's untied. One is you're tied, you're tethered. Mutar means you're untethered. Something's forbidden, you're tethered, you're held back. As much as you want to break out, you can't break out. That's exactly what when the Torah gives prohibitions. Or rabbinically, you have prohibitions. They're isurim, the things which tether us, which hold us back. Without that, and the Or Chaim concludes, without siyogim, without defenses, there is no Torah. Because man, it's inevitable, we're off the cliff. As they say in English, he's up and running. Where? To go off the cliff. And every human being is going in that direction. And we believe that it's a straight way, and we don't realize that the roadway ends in only 20 feet. But the evil inclination could hoodwink us and confuse us and convince us that Gehenna is paradise and paradise is Gehenna. Day is night and night is day. You never know. Therefore, the Torah juxtaposes the law of the Hebrew slave. You just stood at Sinai. The man's called the Hebrew. He's not even called Yisrael. That's how out of touch he is. The man has a blockage. You never know. We find that all meal offerings in the Torah are made of matzah. They're not leavened. What does leavened grain represent? Leavened grain is what we call chametz. Chametz is something which ferments, and because of that fermentation, it's tastier, and also it rises. Now, what does rising represent, and what does tastiness represent? Something that's tastier, we're drawn to that. That represents desire. What is something which is low and then it swells? What does that represent? That's called inflation of ego. That's arrogance. That's being pompous. The characteristics of chametz represents negative characteristics, which actually overtake a person's life. Ego-driven, temptation-driven. Matzah represents something that's bland. You don't gravitate towards that. It's low, humility. Okay? Now, all meal offerings, except for two, were made of wheat flour, not barley flour. Except the two, which are made of barley flour. The majority of wheat is designated for human consumption, not for animal consumption. The majority of barley is animal fodder. The majority of barley. Now, after we left Egypt, there's a korban, a communal sacrifice. It's called korban ha'omer, the Omer sacrifice. The Omer sacrifice is comprised of barley, which is the only communal offering which is not wheat flour. On Shavuos, which we commemorate nationhood, when we became God's people, we bring, in addition to the sacrifice, we bring, it's called shtei alechem, 2 loaves made of wheat flour. So Maral of Prague explains why on the 50th day did we bring wheat flour, and when we left Egypt, the second day, we bring barley flour. Now, when we left Egypt, at what level were we at? We're at the 49th level of impurity, the lowest level at the point of spiritual extinction. So in terms of what a human being should have been, which we were not, what would we equate ourselves to what? To an animal. As an animal is devoid of spirituality, we as human beings were devoid of spirituality. So to connote that state at that moment, we bring a barley offering. The Omer is a communal offering, but it's barley. That reflects our spiritual status at that moment. Total devoid of spirituality. We ascend the ladder to the 49th level of spiritual purity, which is the pinnacle of our spirituality, and therefore we were qualified to be the recipients of the Torah and become God's people. We bring shtei alechem, 2 loaves of wheat flour. Wheat connotes human consumption. We achieve that level of what? Of atem kri modom. Now you've classified as Adam pre-sin. That's what happened on the 50th day. We rose to that level of spiritual perfection. It's connoted through the ingredient of that meal offering, which is wheat, not barley. So I ask the question. That wheat offering, which is the shtei alechem, it's one of the only meal offerings that are chametz. All meal offerings are not chametz, are not leavened. The 2 loaves that you bring as that communal offering to connote that now you've achieved a level of Adam pre-sin, and you're assuming his value. Why is it chametz? Chametz indicates what? Indicates the evil inclination. It's the negative. It should be matzah. It should be representing humility and lack of temptation. That's what the Torah is all about. Restraint, humility, knowing who you are. The Torah says, no, it's wheat, but that wheat is leavened. So the way we explained it was, we find that God didn't associate his name with the patriarchs until after they passed away, except for Yitzchak. God did not say, I am Elokei Avram until Avram was no longer alive. God did not say, I'm Elokei Yaakov until Yaakov was no longer alive. Why? So the Gemara tells us, the Midrash tells us, because Al Tamid Ba'atzcha Ad Yom Moscha, until the last moment of our life, the last breath of life, a person is the position of free will. What would be if Avram, the last breath of his life prior to that, he should choose to deny God's existence? That's within his power of choice. As long as he's alive, he has a power of choice. God doesn't want to associate his name with a person where at the last moment that person's able to renege or extricate himself from that relationship. Only once a person passes away and he's secure in who he was and is, God now associates his name. But as long as you're alive, you can't believe in yourself until when you're no longer alive, because only then you know you're no longer vulnerable. We're talking about the patriarchs. Avram Avinu, Yaakov Avinu, the most special of the patriarchs, the one who fathered the 12 tribes, the one who created the insular environment in Egypt for the Jewish people, that the bondage didn't touch them until he passed away. And even him, God would not associate his name with him, because you never know what can happen at the last moment. So what does that mean? You can be the pinnacle of your spirituality, but you can never forget who you are. We're still human. Being human, there's vulnerability. So what the chometz, the leaven in those shtei alechem, although wheat is human consumption, but you can never forget there's that trace of that temptation, which is called evil inclination within us, that he can push you off in a cliff in a moment. And as I said, it's a slippery slope. We talk about the 10 commandments, prophesizing face to face. The next moment, we're talking about a man who becomes a thief, and he's sold into slavery. He's given a Canaanite woman, slave woman. All of a sudden, he loves his wife, his children, and his master, although neither of these individuals are anything what he says they are. He's perceiving as at that due to his temptation, due to his fall to that level. Therefore, the Torah is putting us in touch with reality. No, there's an expression we used to say, today you don't hear it, but it was post-World War II. Wake up. Wake up and die right. No, got to wake up to reality. Reality of life is temptation. It's irrelevant who you are, what you are. We're human. It's called human frailties. It's called vulnerability. And the Torah is saying it clearly through the juxtaposition of the 10 commandments. And immediately, the man who steals and he can't reimburse the victim, or a person who sells himself into slavery after he understands that he's God, the Prince of God. How do you become a slave of a mortal if you're God's servant? It's disgraceful. The answer is we're able to live our lives as if the past never happened. Nothing. You know, it's interesting. Rashi brings a beautiful allegory, medrash, a mashal. We find that we have the batter, the mud, miracle food, sustains us. There's no waste. And then the Jews start complaining. Where's the water? Where's the water? And they spoke out of turn. They said, Em yesh Elokim b'kimbeinu u'moyin. Is God in our midst or is he not? So Moshe says to the Jews, Lamus nasis Hashem. You realize what you just said, you're really speaking out of turn, you're testing God. What do you mean? Ayesh Elokim b'kimbeinu u'moyin. Is God in our midst or not? So Rashi cites the Midrash. What is it analogous to? The son is on his father's shoulders, and the father's walking, and he sees something on the ground, and he says to his father, could you please get that for me and retrieve it for me and give it to me? Father does it. Whatever the child asks the father accommodates the child. And all of a sudden, the father is walking, and a person approaches the father and says, to the child on top of his father's shoulder. By the way, where's your father? So the child says to the stranger, I have no idea where he is. You're sitting on the shoulders. He just accommodated everything any wish you had. And now you say to the stranger, you don't know where your father is. You know what the father does? He takes his kid off his shoulders, throws him to the ground, and he says, let the dogs eat you. You're going to learn a lesson. You get bitten by the dogs now, then you'll understand who your father is. God just provided your life on a silver platter, every accommodation. He's giving you the manna. Now you tell me, because you don't have the champagne, vintage 1926. What's going on? What's going on over here? Where's God? How could you deny him? But you know something? You could speak out of turn this way. Despite everything, people have short memories. It's as if we have amnesia. That's the way we live our lives sometimes. The Rambam Hilchos Tshuva in Hilchos Tshuva says,
all right, sir, you have a nice day now.
Thank you. He says that besides the mitzvah of shofar, which is a Torah, which is a divine obligation, there's a subtle message in the shofar. Uru yishenim yishenaschem. Those who are sleeping, wake up. That's the sound it's a wake-up call. Hokitzu b'targameschem. Shake yourselves out of your slumber. People like we live in a trance. We drift through life. We see things, but we just gloss over them. We're not touched by them. And that's the reality of every human being. And we're all subject to this. And we're drawn into this slumber. We see and we don't see. We notice, but it doesn't resonate. My mashgiach, Zichron Levrocha, who was a student of Mir Yeshiva in Europe, a student of the Mir Mashgiach, Reb Chatzkel Levenstein, Zichron Levrocha, and Reb Yerucham used to say, most of the people on the Zoom are old enough, they remember the subway system in the 50s in New York City. If you rode the subway system, when it used to cost 15 cents to get on the subway, and you put a token in, well, then you had a card when you traveled the subway from school. So the subways, the noise was deafening. Literally, the screeching, the noise. And if you sat on a seat, the cars rumbled and shook violently. You'd sit on the seat, you get thrown off to the floor. To that degree. That's how violently they shook. They quaked. But yet, in 5 minutes, people were fast asleep. How do you fall asleep with such deafening sounds and noise? The answer is, the way God created a human being, once you get into the rhythm, you can be lulled into that particular rhythm. But it's deafening, jolting. You can be thrown off. Everybody's sleeping, they're even snoring. That's how deeply they're asleep. That is the nature of a human being. We easily transition, acclimate ourselves to be something it's not even recognizable. Therefore, the Talmud tells us, Divrei Torah tzrichen chizuk. You can never rest on your laurels. Rashi explains a person who's a martial arts expert, master. You have to practice continuously. That every move is reflexive. You don't even have to think. Because the moment you have to stop to think what your next move is, that moment of hesitation could cost you your life. It has to be reflexive. That's how quick it has to come. Torah has to be so embedded in our emotion, in our minds, in our actions, without thinking. It's not a consideration other than doing the right thing. Of course, you infuse it with intent, which qualitatively advances it. But in terms of the actual action, the action is done naturally. You know, every morning we say in the Birchas HaShachar, we say, ask Hashem, v'targileinu b'sorasecha. In Hebrew, the word regilus means it becomes ordinary, ragil. A person is naturally, he comes to it. We study Torah, it should be natural. There should be no inertia. There should be no pushback. You call up a person, would you like to study tonight? Takes him 6 minutes to give you an answer. And after he thinks, he says, I'll call you back 15 minutes after I think about it. And after he thinks about it, calls you back, he says, I'll have to discuss it with my wife. After he discusses with his wife has to call her mother to find out if there's any conflict. You ever hear such a thing? We're talking about people understand that you have an obligation to study. There's more red tape to learn for that half an hour than going through the government. You ever hear such a thing? We ask Hashem Sh'targ Leib B'Sar. Comes natural. No complications. You ease in it naturally because the nature of a person is not that. Naturally, we're not geared in that direction. We're not wired that way. It's only through conditioning and through spiritualization, through mitzvahs, that creates that spiritualization that rewires us. And as a result of that, we naturally function differently than initially we functioned. Like people say, two friends hadn't seen each other since they were teenagers. 30, 40, 50 years pass and he meets him. This person becomes great, I'm using the word Talmud Chacham, mentors students, and the other person is an ordinary guy as a Jew, although he's made a lot of money. Just by looking at the two, both fine people, but they're worlds apart. And it's not that the Talmud Chacham is out of touch with reality. He understands reality better than the Wall Street person. Because everything is not the trade. That's not what it's about. It's not the profit. It's not the rating. It's doing the right thing and understanding the one who rates us is God. You're not rated by Dun & Bradstreet or by other rating organizations. That's not what it's about. Well, the Better Business Bureau, that used to be one who evaluated you, If your customers are coming back or they're not coming back. You want to have a good rating. But that's what it's about. And understanding the reality. Chazal give us the best advice. Divrei Torah tzricha chizuk. You always have to have, it's interesting. A person's a doctor, outstanding doctor. Every year he has to take certain courses to get credits. You're a lawyer. Whatever field you're in, you always have to make sure you're in touch and you're up on your game. There's no oversights. Otherwise, you could lose your license. You could be disenfranchised. Comes to religion. I know more than most. Most know nothing. I know a little bit more than nothing. Okay. That makes you an expert. And even if you know, what does it mean being out of touch? Out of touch means you're not fully engaged. You only know how out of touch you are when you're in touch, in touch, how not in touch you are because you should even be more in touch. And that's the reality of life. Ve'ela Hamishpatim. In Hebrew, the vav is a connecting word. And all these laws that the Torah speaks about in this portion are rational laws. The laws of custodianship, what are liabilities, what are responsibilities. This is really how a society functions and how it sticks together, and it's really cohesive and it's equitable. That's what it speaks about. The beginning. The previous portion, we speak about God speaking openly to us, which is no question. Irrefutably, it's the word of Hashem, the 10 commandments. And then we speak about rational laws. You'd say, something. We had such great legislators, Brandeis, Supreme Court Justice, one of the great legislators. We had great rabbis. They were great legislators. They were only transmitters of the tradition. These laws, as they may be crucial and basic for a society to function, but these are divine, no less than putting on tefillin and no less than not eating chametz on Pesach. These rational laws. But how do I know that? How do we know these are not man-made? And I'll create a new set of laws. The Hamishpatim. And this is a continuum. This is a continuum of what was stated in the previous portion. That's Sinai, this is Sinai. So therefore, you can't dismiss these things. Nothing can be taken or minimized as much as an iota. Because every aspect, every trace, every nuance of these laws, and every application is God's word. That's what it is. So that one vav is more than an eye-opener. It establishes the reality of what our laws are. Even the rational laws, which you may be able to come through your own initiative and your own experience of life, these are divine. And therefore, they're immutable. Regardless of much as society changes, the Torah itself is immutable. It doesn't change. As the Rambam says in the 13 tenets of Jewish belief, the Torah will never ever be exchanged or changed. It's immutable. That's one of the tenets of Jewish belief. There's no such thing as progressive Judaism. The principles are etched in stone. If you understand the principle, the applications can apply to other settings, but it's the exact same application. It's no different. But you have to be able to understand the inner workings to apply it to another situation. We're going to stop here now, and if there are any comments, I'm willing to entertain the comments.
Rabbi.
One second.